mind, brain, and experimental psychology. Introduction. So far, we have examined the authors whose works laid the foundation of what we now know as experimental psychology. As you can see, most of our discussions have been on philosophical psychology and psychological physiology. In this study session, we shall examine how the study of the mind and the brain finally led to the formal birth of experimental psychology. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Highlight the contributions of Fechner, Helmholtz, Wundt, and Herbert to the development of experimental psychology. 2. Outline the development of experimental psychology from physiological psychology. Contributions of Gustav Theodor Fechner, 1801 to 1887. Fechner was born in Groß-Sachsen, Prussia. At the age of 16, he enrolled for the study of medicine at the University of Leipzig, where he studied anatomy under Weber. By 1824, he was lecturing in physics, and in 1834, he had over 40 publications to his credit. He was appointed professor of physics at the University of Leipzig. Fechner's psychological interests began to manifest themselves towards the end of the 1830s in papers on the perception of complementary and subjective colors. It is in the work that we find the formal beginning of experimental psychology. Before Fechner, as Boring 1950 tells us, there was only psychological physiology and philosophical psychology. It was Fechner who performed with scientific rigor those first experiments, which laid the foundations for the new psychology and the basis of his methodology. Between 1851 and 1860, Fechner worked out the rationale for measuring sensation indirectly in terms of the unit of just noticeable difference between two sensations, developed his 3 basic psychophysical methods (just noticeable differences, right and wrong cases, and average error), and carried out the classical experiments on tactual and visual distance, visual brightness, and lifting weight. He had impact on scientists such as Helmholtz, Ernst Mach, A.W. Volkmann, Delboeuf, and others. By combining methodological innovation in measurement with careful experimentation, Fechner moved beyond Herbert to answer Kant's second objection regarding the possibility of scientific psychology. Mental events could, Fechner showed, not only be measured, but measured in terms of their relationship to physical events. In achieving this milestone, Fechner demonstrated the potential for quantitative, experimental exploration of the phenomenology of sensory experience and established psychophysics as one of the core methods of the newly emerging scientific psychology. Contributions of Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920. Wundt was born at Neckarau and received his early education at the hands of a private tutor and at the Broskal Gymnasium. At age 19, he set off to study medicine at Tübingen, where his uncle, Frederick Arnold, held the chair in anatomy and physiology. During his first summer semester, he worked intensively on the study of cerebral anatomy under Arnold's guidance, and by the end of the summer, he had decided to make physiology his career. When his uncle moved to Edinburgh to direct the Institute of Anatomy, Wundt followed, completing his medical studies in 1855. After a year of hospital work and a journey to Berlin for a semester of study under Moller and Du Bois-Reymond, Wundt returned to Edinburgh in 1857 as docent in physiology, becoming assistant to Helmholtz in the following year. Wundt began the study of sense perception that led to a series of publications collected in 1862. As his Betrageuse theory, the Sinneswahrnehmung. The Betrage consisted of 6 previously published articles on sense perception, preceded by methodological introduction. In these articles, Wundt provided the basics of a psychological theory of the perception of space, in brackets, including some discussion of the need for unconscious inference apparently arrived at independently of Helmholtz. Reviewed the history of theories of vision and analyzed the psychological functions of sensation arising from visual accommodation and eye movement, presented the results of experiments of binocular contrast effects and stereoscopic fusion. He also argued, contra Hubbard, that the content of consciousness at a given instant always consists of a single, unconsciously integrated percept. Rejecting a metaphysical foundation for psychology, Wundt argued for the need to transcend the limitation of the direct study of consciousness through the use of genetic, comparative, statistical, historical, and particularly experimental methods. Only in this way, he suggested, would it be possible to come to a needed understanding of conscious phenomena as complex products of the unconscious mind. Page 6. Wundt, still at Heidelberg, began to work towards the conception of physiological psychology that was to serve as the basis for his systematic approach to experimentation. In 1867, in a new quarterly journal of psychiatry, founded by Max Ledersdorf and Theodor Meinet, Wundt published an invited article wherein, under the banner of physiological psychology, he reviewed recent literature on visual space perception and the measurement of the time taken by mental operations. As an outgrowth of this review, Wundt offered a series of lectures on physiological psychology in the winter of 1867 and 1868, and 1872 and 1873. Around the same time, he was preparing the text, which Bohr in 1950 later regarded as the most important book in the history of modern psychology. Issued in 2 parts, in 1873 and 1874, the Grundzüge der physiologischen Psychologie was the first comprehensive handbook of modern experimental psychology, published by Wundt. It was, as Boring tells us, on the one hand, the concrete result of Wundt's intellectual development at Heidelberg and the symbol of his metamorphosis from physiologist to psychologist, and on the other hand, the beginning of the new independent science. Although the theories elaborated in the Grundzüge changed over the 5 major revisions, the essential structure of Wundt's system, his great argument for an experimental psychology, had been reasonably well worked out by 1874. In that year, Wundt accepted a call to the University of Zurich, where he worked for a year, moving in 1875 to Leipzig to assume the chair in philosophy. Wundt seemed, as early as the winter of 1879 and 1880, to have nonetheless allowed two students, G. Stanley Hall and Max Friedrich, to occupy themselves with research investigations. This research took place in a small classroom in the convict building that had earlier been assigned to Wundt for use as a storage area. Humble though it may have been, this small space constituted the first laboratory in the world devoted to original psychological research. Experimental psychology, born with Fechner, nurtured by Helmholtz and Dundas, was to be raised by Wundt. Over the years, until his retirement in 1917, Wundt served as the de facto parent of the new psychology. Students from all over the world, especially from the United States, journeyed to Leipzig to learn experimental technique, to return to their home institutions imbued with the spirit of scientific psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of structuralism, school of psychology, is considered as the father of experimental psychology. He established the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, and thus he was the first researcher, experimental psychologist. Wundt was the first to call himself a psychologist. In the first half of the 20th century, experimental psychology became closely allied with behaviorism, especially in the United States, and this led to some neglect of mental phenomena. In Europe, including the United Kingdom, this was less so, and under the influence of psychologists such as Sir Frederick Bartlett, Kenneth Craig, W.E. Hick, and Donald Broadbent, experimental psychologists focused on topics such as thinking, memory, and attention, laying the foundations for the subsequent development of cognitive psychology. Contributions of Hermann Ludwig Ferdinand von Helmholtz, 1821 to 1894. Hermann Ludwig Ferdinand von Helmholtz, 1821 to 1894, was born in Potsdam and educated at the Potsdam Gymnasium and at the Friedrich Wilhelm Medical Institute in Berlin. In Berlin, he came under the influence of Muller, and in 1842, at 21 years of age, he graduated with a degree in medicine and entered the service of the Prussian army as a physician. In reaction to Muller's vitalism, which he rejected, Helmholtz became interested in clarifying the psychological basis of animal heat, a phenomenon that was sometimes used to help justify vitalism. This led in 1847 to a famous paper on the conservation of energy, which in turn brought Helmholtz the offer of professorship of physiology at Königsberg, where he remained from 1848 to 1855. In 1855, he moved to Bonn, and from Bonn in 1858 to Heidelberg to serve as director of the Institute of Physiology. It was during the Bonn and Heidelberg periods that Helmholtz made his most fundamental contributions to the newly emerging experimental psychology. Contributions of Franciscus Cornelis Dundas, 1818 to 1889. Between 1865 and 1868, another great physiologist, Franciscus Cornelis Dundas, 1818 to 1889, assimilated the reaction time procedure to psychology, employing it to study the time taken up by mental operations. Dundas was born in the town of Tilburg in the Netherlands and entered the University of Utrecht as a medical student at the age of 17. Having received the degree, He joined the military as a surgeon and at the age of 24 was invited to teach at the military medical school at Utrecht. 5 years later, Dundas was offered a position as extraordinarius at the University of Utrecht, which he accepted, remaining there for the remainder of his career. In 1865, Dundas published a preliminary communication in which he reported work carried out with a student, Johann Jacob de Jager, and summarized more fully in de Jager's doctoral dissertation, De Physiologische Psychische Processen, 1865, reasoning that reaction time was addictive. Dundas separately assessed the time taken to respond to a stimulus under conditions of choice and simple non-choice, subtracting simple non-choice from choice reaction time. Dundas computed the interval taken by a decision process. In 1868, in a classic paper appearing in German, Dundas provided the definitive reports of the results of this work and its extension to discrimination times. Although the specifics of Dundas' findings are of little interest today, his use of the reaction technique to measure the time taken by mental processes exacted a major impact on his contemporaries, and reaction time was installed, along with psychophysics as a method of choice in the early experimental laboratory. Study session summary. In this study session, we focused on the contributions of philosophers in the study of the mind, brain, and the experimental psychology of consciousness. Gustav Theodor Fechner, 1801 to 1887, performed with scientific rigor the first experiments which laid the foundation for the new psychology and still lie at the basis of his methodology. He demonstrated the potential for quantitative, experimental exploration of the phenomenology of sensory experience and established psychophysics as one of the core methods of the newly emerging scientific psychology. Hermann Ludwig Ferdinand von Helmholtz, 1821 to 1894, propounded a comprehensive theory of color vision and a famous unconscious inference theory of perception. Franciscus Cornelis Dundas, 1818 to 1889, assimilated the reaction time procedure to psychology, employing it to study the time taken up by mental operations. Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, rejected a metaphysical foundation for psychology and argued for the need to transcend the limitation of the direct study of consciousness through the use of genetic, comparative, statistical, historical, and particularly experimental methods. Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of structuralism school of psychology, is considered as the father of experimental psychology. End of study session 3. Thank you for listening.